The Lost Gospel of Mary, Mother of Jesus, Forgotten Perspectives. A gloved hand parts the dimness, dust motes turning like slow constellations above brittle parchment. Inked letters, cramped and uneven from a distant hand, catch the light and a single line of speech breathes into the room, a woman's voice, intimate and direct, as if she were leaning across a kitchen table rather than 4 centuries and a library away. That moment, soft, accidental, and electric, frames the question that follows: what if the most intimate voice in early Christianity was quietly erased from the story we think we know? The discovery is small and private, but it has the gravity of a bell tolling underwater. Its ripple reaches beyond archives and scholars to anyone who has ever wondered who gets to speak for a community and who is left out. This script starts there, in the hush of an archive, and moves outward. It is not an academic lecture. It aims to be a narrated experience that places the listener inside the tactile world of vanished pages, contested canons, and the human choices that shape memory. The problem is not only that texts were lost or suppressed, it is that a particular voice, nuanced in theology, decisive in leadership, and rooted in ordinary relationships, was pushed to the margins until it almost disappears. The stakes are personal and institutional. How do we reconstruct a past when the record is incomplete by design? And what happens to identity and belief when whole conversations are excised? You will be guided through close observations and intimate scenes that make the past feel immediate. Expect textures: vellum that smells faintly of animal and glue, the metallic scrape of a conservator's blade, the soft rustle of pages turned under breath. Expect argument and counterargument: scholars who defend the canon as settled history, historians who see institutional consolidation and social pressure at work, descendants who feel the absence as an open question in their family stories. And expect moments where the absent voice is allowed to speak again, through translations that listen for cadence and tone, through reenactments that favor shadow and suggestion over literal reconstruction, through interviews that treat interpretation as contested rather than settled. A central element of this piece is the tension between immediate, sensory detail and larger historical forces. The gloved hand that reveals a line of text is also a figure who stands between preservation and interpretation. Each manuscript is both object and argument, each marginal note or erasure is a trace of human decision. Rather than smoothing those traces into a single conclusion, this narrative invites you to hold them in tension, notice the textures, hear the fragments, weigh the arguments. If this voice intrigues you, subscribe to follow the unfolding story and join a community that listens closely to overlooked echoes. We will not rush to simple answers. Instead, the journey will move through discovery, debate, and reflection, giving space to the fragments and the people who protect them. The unique angle of this script is its insistence that intimacy matters in history, that a single conversational line can alter how we understand authority, gender, memory, and faith. By beginning in the concrete and moving outward into contested meaning, the narrative asks listeners to reconsider where authority comes from and who decides which voices belong in the archive. The path ahead will oscillate between the tactile and the communal, the archival and the affective. It will ask uncomfortable questions about loss and recovery without pretending there is a neat resolution waiting at the end. Instead, it will lead to a quiet but persistent invitation, to listen again to a past that was made to be silent and to carry the implications of that listening into the present. Bright light from imaging rigs can make vanished ink reappear as if a ghost were stepping into focus. In place of simple inspection, scientists now coax hidden writing out of layers that look uniformly blank to the naked eye. By running electromagnetic scans and spectral maps, technicians trace chemical signatures where pigments once lingered and forge digital negatives that reveal whole lines scraped away generations ago. Picture a blank rectangle on a page suddenly spidering with letters, an entire clause resurfacing that alters the meaning of a sentence you thought you understood. Now, imagine watching that transformation while a translator murmurs probable renderings. The text is no longer hypothetical but a recovered argument once spoken aloud in a particular community. A different dimension concerns networks of everyday authority that left minimal paper trails. Women who organized meal sharing, taught infants prayers, or mediated disputes rarely wrote formal doctrinal treatises, yet they shaped practice through repeated interaction. Oral formulas circulated, adapted, and were sometimes committed to ephemeral supports, cloth, wax tablets, lead tokens, that seldom survived. Consider a household mnemonic woven into a tapestry or sewn into a baptismal shawl. Its wording shifts through generations, but the core instruction persists in living memory. When you consider such living transmission, the absence of a canonical title does not equal absence of doctrinal influence. The teaching might simply have traveled along channels that archival systems undervalue. Institutional choices also worked like an editorial hand pruning an overgrown manuscript. Patrons with resources determined which libraries received copies, which scripts were recopied in deluxe formats, and which vernacular texts were elevated into public liturgy. Those economic decisions often reflected social priorities rather than textual merit. Imagine a small treatise circulated in a provincial town being passed over because its supporters lacked means to commission a new codex. A rival text, backed by a wealthy monastery, becomes the default. In that environment, marginal voices could be squeezed economically out of circulation, lost not through explicit censorship alone but through selective investment and neglect. Think of it as marketplace dynamics applied to sacred literature. Performance practices offered another route for influence and suppression. Some teachings took the form of dramatized instruction, short liturgical plays, call-and-response refrains, and choreographed gestures that embodied theology. These were powerful in shaping belief because they engaged bodies and emotions as much as intellect. If such performances were associated with particular social groups, later authorities might reduce their prominence by excluding them from standardized rites. Picture a chant sung only by women in a courtyard fading into silence when public worship moved indoors and became regulated. The melody survives only as a fragmented line quoted by a later polemicist who misunderstands its context. If tracing these hidden pathways intrigues you, follow along. There are more rediscoveries to come that complicate simple narratives. Midway through our exploration we will surface concrete examples where technical recovery and social historical reconstruction overlap, exposing textual strata that shift attribution, reshape chronology, or illuminate local practices previously ignored. Expect surprises, a marginal rubric reframing a leader's role, an erased commentary that recasts a contested phrase, or a pattern of ownership marks suggesting female custodianship of a cluster of texts. Finally, keep in mind that recovering lost material often raises as many interpretive puzzles as answers. When a paleographic lab restores a line, you must ask about its original audience, performance mode, and subsequent transmission, questions that require experts from chemistry to comparative religion working together. These intersections, between material science, social history, and ritual practice, are where new possibilities for understanding live. Ahead lies a deeper dive into specific recovered passages and how they changed the shape of early communities, but for now, hold the image of reclaimed script as an active puzzle piece in a shifting mosaic. A trail of ownership marks often hides in plain sight, stamped seals pressed into bindings, clipped receipts tucked between gatherings, scribbled names at the ends of gatherings that record who read, borrowed, or safeguarded a work. Tracing these small signals reconstructs a chain of custody that can reveal networks of readers overlooked by conventional narratives. Picture a slender slip of paper folded into a book, its handwriting naming a woman who paid for the repair after a flood. Such an incidental record reframes assumptions about custodial authority. Now, consider how a cluster of these modest artifacts, when mapped across time and place, can expose an informal circulation route that bypassed official centers and sustained particular teachings through private patronage. Beyond the physical trail, computational approaches can help disentangle layered authorship. Algorithms that measure cadence, habitual phrasing, and syntactic footprints permit scholars to cluster anonymous passages with known writers. Think of it as acoustic fingerprinting applied to prose. Patterns that escape human notice emerge with surprising clarity when numbers are plotted. When you hear that two anonymous sermons line up stylistically with documents associated with a peripheral community, what changes is not merely attribution but the perceived geography of influence. If this piques your curiosity, consider subscribing to follow the unfolding analyses and debates as new datasets appear online. In parallel, visual culture preserves theological priorities in ways words sometimes do not. Painted captions, carved inscriptions, and embroidered motifs encode doctrinal claims and communal memory. A mural showing a group around a central female figure, accompanied by a brief caption in a local dialect, can function as testimony to leadership even when written treatises have vanished. Such images operate as communal shorthand. They communicate roles, honorifics, and liturgical functions to a broad audience. Examining iconographic conventions across regions exposes convergences that suggest shared practices, not isolated aberrations. Civic archives contribute an unexpectedly rich vein of evidence. Property charters, tax rolls, and dispute petitions occasionally name women as custodians of church property or as litigants defending community rights. These entries offer a bureaucratic mirror to grassroots religious life, demonstrating that theological influence could carry legal consequence. When a land grant references a communal altar maintained by a household under a woman's supervision, that administrative note amplifies a voice that formal theological anthologies might have overlooked. Such intersections of law and devotion complicate tidy narratives about who held ecclesial power. Ritual calendars and local commemorations register memory in compressed form. Feast days, recorded in parish lists or prayer books, enshrine persons whose doctrinal contributions were celebrated annually. A recurring entry for a female leader's memorial points to ongoing communal recognition that textual canons may not reflect. These calendar entries act like social barometers. A name that appears year after year signals durable esteem and shapes how subsequent generations interpret precedent. For listeners, this suggests that authority often lived in lived time, annual gestures, not just canonical decrees. Finally, contemporary archival practices themselves reshape recovery possibilities. Digital repositories, crowdsourced transcription projects, and cross-disciplinary databases make dispersed fragments interoperable in ways impossible a generation ago. When a tiny scrap cataloged in a municipal archive links, via a shared proper name or formula, to an item housed miles away, aggregated access alters scholarly imagination. You, as a listener, are part of that ecosystem. By engaging with online platforms that host these materials, you help sustain the momentum of discovery and critique. Memory does not archive like a library, it sculpts by repetition. In living communities, recollection favors coherence over nuance, pruning episodes until a tidy plot remains. That dynamic matters deeply when you try to recover a marginalized speaker. The stories easiest to pass along are those that fit pre-existing expectations, not the ones that complicate them. Picture a vivid, complicated set of recollections about a leader reduced, over generations, to a single emblematic phrase that everyone can quote. What survives is emblem, not full argument. Now, consider how this process invisibly reshapes identity in ways a text alone cannot reveal. Next, examine the mental shortcuts individuals use when they retell. People tend to default to simplified character types, compressing diverse actions into archetypal roles that are easier to remember and transmit. Such compression can convert a nuanced theological stance into a sloganized dictum. Because listeners often prize memorable turns of phrase, socially salient metaphors eclipse procedural detail. These metaphors then anchor communal memory and resist later attempts to reintroduce complexity. For those reconstructing a voice, distinguishing memorable shorthand from substantive teaching becomes a central analytic task. Group dynamics compound individual distortions. When a story is told collectively, a few confident narrators often set the tone and facts that others adopt, a process that strengthens conformity and reduces variance. Over repeated public performances, banquets, markets, neighborhood gatherings, certain elements gain ritual authority simply through repetition, while other details fade for want of repetition. This social consolidation can create the illusion of unanimous recollection even when the original record was diverse. As you listen to reconstructed fragments, weigh how much communal rehearsal might have smoothed rough edges into apparent consensus. Emotional salience also guides survival. Episodes that evoke strong affect, outrage, grief, triumph, are sticky. Consequently, a single dramatic episode associated with a figure can eclipse a lifetime of quieter leadership. A community that remembers a flashpoint more readily than steady governance inadvertently narrows the portrait it hands down. For scholars, parsing which recollections are emotionally amplified versus which convey routine practice is essential. the loudness of a memory does not equate to its representativeness. Methodologically, there are ways to triangulate between memory's distortions and material traces. Analysts map variant retellings across space and time, looking for patterns of convergence and divergence that signal genuine commonalities rather than coincidental echoes. They also pay attention to hedging language, phrases that signal uncertainty, attribution, or reported speech, which can reveal that a memory originated in hearsay rather than direct experience. When you hear repeated qualifiers in multiple sources, treat them as signposts pointing to layers of transmission rather than as noise to be discarded. A practical illustration clarifies the stakes. Imagine 3 independent oral traditions describing a council meeting where a woman intervened. One tradition recalls the intervention as an appeal for charity, another preserves a technical theological rejoinder, a third remembers a structural reorganization proposal. If communal retellings later highlight only the charitable angle because it resonates culturally, the theological and administrative contributions may vanish from popular memory. Reconstructing the fuller picture requires treating the residual charitable motif as incomplete evidence rather than as the sole legacy. Finally, ethical practice matters here as much as method. Responsible reconstruction resists the temptation to fill gaps with elegant narratives that satisfy modern expectations. Instead, present multiple plausible reconstructions, flag the confidence level in each, and remain transparent about where memory likely reshaped original speech. When you engage with these fragments, do so knowing that what you hear is a layered artifact, part human recollection, part social curation, and that honoring the complexity of that layering brings you closer to a fairer historiography. A deliberate erasure can be as loud as a proclamation. In several late antique sites, entire inscriptions were physically removed, mosaics with names ground down, dedicatory plaques pried off the wall and reused in mundane construction, funerary markers reburied under new foundations. Imagine a mosaic tesserae field where one face has been sanded away so skillfully that only the pattern of abrasion betrays the missing portrait. That kind of suppression is not accidental loss, it is a targeted strategy to excise an actor from communal memory. Treat these interventions like archaeological redactions, the absence itself becomes evidence, and tracing the chronology of removal offers a map of political and theological pressure points that conventional narratives often miss. Acoustic space manufactures memory in ways visible records cannot capture. The echo profile of a courtyard, the short reverberation of a timber hall, or the resonant hush of a stone baptistry favors different speech rhythms and mnemonic structures. A phrase that fits perfectly into a slow, round chant will stick in congregational recollection, a dense, argument-heavy sentence will not. Using digital acoustical reconstructions, researchers now test how early worship settings would have shaped oral retention. Picture a reconstructed house church where a 3-syllable refrain blooms into communal call-and response. Such sonic affordances can explain why certain doctrinal formulas propagated while more elaborate formulations vanished. Private correspondence offers another untapped archive of voice. Short, practical letters, requests for aid, reports on disputes, instructions for funerary rites, survive in later compilations more often than polished treatises. When a polemicist quotes an intimate missive to discredit its author, that quotation may inadvertently preserve tone and rhetoric better than any surviving sermon. Consider a scenario where a bishop's curt letter appears inside a legal docket. The brusque syntax and intimate salutations reveal a leadership style rooted in negotiation rather than public declaration. These epistolary fragments, when read as performances of relationship, help reconstruct how authority operated day to day. Experimental reconstruction can move hypotheses into the realm of testable practice. Fieldwork that asks contemporary participants to transmit unrehearsed directives under varying conditions, different lighting, background noise, group size, produces measurable differences in accuracy and retention. Researchers have staged reenactments where volunteers learn short ritual sequences either as text, as melody, or as embodied gesture. Outcomes show that certain combinations dramatically increase fidelity across generations. When you listen to a recovered fragment now, think about which sensory packaging would have made it survivable, and what that implies about the original community's priorities. Chemical traces embedded in domestic refuse reveal devotional routines otherwise invisible. Lipid residues, smoke particulates trapped in thin-walled pottery, and minute phytoliths recovered from hearths can indicate what substances were burned, eaten, or offered in private rites. For example, a jar rim carrying traces of aromatic compounds associated with a specific resin suggests a household maintained a habitual practice of scented commemoration. These biomolecular signatures open a window into the flavors and smells that composed everyday piety and, importantly, who maintained them within the household economy. Now, consider how this applies when you confront gaps in your own inherited narratives: a missing diary, a silenced ancestor, a community tradition abandoned after migration. The methods scholars use, reading absences, testing the acoustics of memory, tracing private letters, staging experimental transmission, and analyzing chemical residues, are tools you can adapt to probe silences closer to home. If you want to keep tracing these recovered lives and follow each new fragment as it appears, stay connected, follow the channel and enable alerts so you don't miss the next piece that surfaces. Portable relics often outlive grand libraries. Small, everyday objects, an unglazed pilgrim ampulla, a bent copper token, a seam of fabric tied into a knot, can trap words or gestures that formal archives discard. Imagine an inch-wide pewter disc found under floorboards bearing a crudely scratched benediction that names a woman as its speaker. Its survival depends less on institutional care than on domestic habit and accidental concealment. These artifacts shift the scale of inquiry. Instead of asking which monasteries preserved a doctrine, interrogate which households kept a phrase alive by habit, hidden in pockets or sewn into clothing. The evidence is fragmentary, sure, but it carries a different kind of authority, one born of repetition within lived practice rather than endorsement by officialdom. Scribal colophons offer another route into personality and provenance that formal canon lists tend to ignore. At the end of many manuscripts, scribes left informal notes, complaints about cold cells, remarks about who commissioned the book, or candid admissions that they copied from a damaged exemplar. Occasionally these notes include surprising attributions, a scribe declaring he transcribed a passage from the words my mother used at the table. That kind of aside, mundane in tone, can realign assumptions about authorship and circulation by signaling oral-to-written pathways. If you find this compelling, consider joining the channel so future discoveries and fragment stories land in your feed. These marginalia often show up in catalogs only after someone takes the time to read to the very last line. Translation choices profoundly remold a voice's perceived agency. Translators habitually substitute culturally familiar titles or neutralize idioms that would jar new readers, and in doing so they sometimes strip away relational cues that anchored a speaker in a community. Where a source language permits direct address with kinship terms that signify authority as well as intimacy, a translator might opt for an impersonal theological term that flattens that relational texture. The result is not mere linguistic drift but a shift in who appears to speak and to whom they are accountable. Tracking these shifts requires not only linguistic skill but also sensitivity to the social registers embedded in tiny particles of speech that ordinary translations tend to erase. Apart from texts and tokens, soundscapes preserved in memory can leave unusual traces in unexpected places. Short refrains embedded in nursery rhymes, instructional songs attached to household chores, or rhythm-driven counting games have proven remarkably durable across migrations. In one reconstructed instance, a work chant used to pace bread-making contains a 4-syllable prayer line that, when sequenced differently, reads like a theological assertion rather than a practical cue. Such mnemonics are rarely catalogued, yet they carry doctrinal freight precisely because they are learned in embodied contexts, hands kneading dough, feet stamping rhythm. Listening for theology in labor songs opens a new archive of vernacular doctrinal transmission. Finally, the history of collecting and cataloging itself has reshaped which voices survive as canonical. Early modern antiquarians often reorganized holdings according to their own schemes, mislabeling items or relegating them to obscure shelves because they did not fit expected categories. A marginal commentary might be filed under a catch-all label and thus escape scholarly notice for centuries. Modern scholars are still untangling these archival accidents by reconstructing original shelving systems, cross-referencing old catalog entries, and even tracking the handwriting of collectors who misfiled materials. That detective work can uncover whole clusters of related items that, assembled together, restore a more complex picture of influence and leadership than any single manuscript could convey. A different set of mechanisms operated less through physical suppression and more through the politics of attribution. One powerful strategy was the deliberate rebranding of authorship. Texts originally composed or transmitted within female-led circles were later issued under the names of prominent male teachers so they would circulate with built-in authority. This is not mere scholarly curiosity, it is a cultural gambit that trades the original speaker's claim to visibility for the safety of an accepted signature. Think of it as shifting the face on a public portrait so that the painting keeps hanging while the person it once honored disappears from view. Closely related is the machinery of rhetorical dismissal that appears across many polemical writings. Adversaries did not always need to accuse a woman of wrongdoing, they could instead frame her contributions as anecdote, gossip, or emotional overflow, thereby reclassifying substantive argument as mere domestic chatter. Language choices mattered enormously. Verbs that suggest temperament rather than reason, metaphors that eroticized authority, or narrative frames that transform instruction into feminine gossip. These moves operate like an interpretive fog, consistent, subtle, and effective, because they convert what might be recognized as theological reasoning into a social category easily ignored by later compilers. At the institutional level, canonical decisions codified these rhetorical hierarchies into enforceable restrictions. Councils and rule collections differentiated between authorized modes of instruction and prohibited speech, often without transparent debate about the underlying reasons. Once a teaching style is declared outside the sanctioned repertoire, subsequent caretakers of tradition treat it as anomalous. Over time, procedural rules about who may speak officially hardened into a legal barrier that excluded whole ways of knowing that had flourished in informal contexts. The legal text thus becomes a gatekeeper, not only of doctrine but of whose voice counts as legitimate evidence. Another invisible process worth attention is cultural repackaging. Male networks frequently absorbed useful practices emerging from female communities but detached them from their original authors. A practical ritual or pastoral method would be taken up, reframed within male discursive frameworks, and then presented as a general improvement rather than as a localized innovation driven by women. The technique survives, the author does not. This selective appropriation creates a historical ledger that credits innovation without acknowledging its true provenance, much like adopting a folk recipe but changing the name on the menu. Detecting these maneuvers requires refined tools of close reading focused on patterns of language and citation that standard philology often overlooks. Scholars examine shifts in honorifics, repeated qualifying phrases that downgrade authority, and chains of paraphrase where content travels but explicit attribution is dropped. Comparative grids that map how a teaching appears across different genres, sermons, legal digests, devotional handbooks, can illuminate the point at which a voice was recoded. When you study these markers, you begin to see not a single act of erasure but a sequence of editorial choices, rhetorical reframings, and legal moves that together remade a speaker's public identity. Now, consider how this applies when you confront a silenced ancestor or a marginalized narrative in your own family or community. Reassess attributions, listen for diminutive language around crucial claims, and ask whether institutional rules later declared universal actually reflect contested social contests. If you are interested in learning to spot these signatures in texts, sign up to follow the next installment where we unpack concrete case studies and walk through the detective work step by step. The patterns are subtle but traceable, and once you recognize them, the historical landscape opens in surprising ways. The way a book is dressed at first glance can decide who speaks for generations. Think of running titles, decorative initials, and the presence or absence of a dedicatory poem. These small editorial flourishes function like stage directions, signaling to a reader which voice to heed and which to treat as ancillary. A running header that names an authority at the top of every page operates like a persistent voiceover. Conversely, a text tucked under a rubricary footnote reads as optional. Picture a medieval binder who chose to place a short devotional tract immediately before a celebrated homily. Every novice who opened that codex encountered the tract first, and over time that sequence lent it unintended prestige. When you examine surviving books, pay attention to these visual cues. They are decisions, not accidents, and they shape reception in ways that simple attribution lists cannot capture. Chronological markers can likewise mislead and reassign credit in unexpected fashion. Scribes often dated entries using local calendars, regnal years, or liturgical cycles that later readers misunderstood or recalibrated. A text stamped with a feast day reference might be read as contemporary to the feast by later catalogers, shifting its apparent date by decades or centuries. Similarly, scribal slip-ups, copying an obsolete indition number or transposing a numeral, can migrate a work into a different intellectual milieu. That chronological drift matters because later interpreters tend to cluster authorship by era, move a composition one generation forward, and it may be absorbed into a different theological dialogue entirely. When you confront an archival note that looks like a simple date, consider which temporal system produced it and who might have misread that system later on. Physical ordering within a binding exerts a subtle editorial pressure distinct from adornment or dating. Quires were not neutral units. Rearranging gatherings, adding fly leaves, or inserting commemorative pages could recontextualize adjacent texts. There are documented cases where a compendium's final treatise, meant as a local appendix, was rebound at the front of subsequent copies and thus read as foundational. Imagine a town clerk rebinding a communal codex after a flood. His pragmatic gesture of preservation inadvertently rewrites the hierarchy of texts for future readers. If you want to trace these silent editorial moves, consider subscribing. New catalog entries and digitized bindings surface these rebinding stories regularly, and alerts will flag fresh examples as scholars publish them. Legal and administrative practices also perform acts of textual canonization by repeated citation. When municipal charters or court records regularly quote a particular formula to settle disputes, that formula accrues normative force irrespective of its author's identity. A ritualized oath used in property litigation, cited across decades of case files, becomes a touchstone for legitimacy. Its wording is treated as communal law even if the originator never intended such elevation. Over time, bureaucratic repetition forges an institutional pedigree. On the ground, this means that a passage can move from private usage into public authority simply through procedural reuse, and its author vanishes into the anonymous machinery of governance. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter inherited texts or oral fragments in your own life. Notice which passages your family places at the front of a notebook, which lines show up in wills or legal forms, and which phrases recur in administrative lists. These placement choices mirror the same mechanisms that remade authorship centuries ago. Take the habit of documenting not just what a source says but where it sits and how it has been employed. Those contextual details often outlive explicit attributions and reveal the true pathways by which voices gained or lost standing. If you want guidance on spotting such structural signatures, stay tuned. Future installments will chart practical checkpoints you can use when examining bindings, dates, and civic citations. Scribes did more than copy text, they set the very grammar of how a voice would be heard by readers centuries later. In scripts where words ran together and sentences lacked clear stops, line endings and visual rhythm became the only cues for emphasis. Later readers, relying on spacing and punctuation systems introduced long after the fact, often reinterpreted where one sentence ended and another began. That silent architecture reshaped argumentation. What might originally read as a responsive aside could be recast as a standalone axiom, and in that recasting the speaker's rhetorical posture shifts. Notice how a seemingly minor orthographic decision can redirect emphasis from relationship to proclamation, altering how a community understands authority. Closely tied to that is the fate of personal markers embedded in grammar. Languages with gendered verbal endings or honorific particles encoded social relations within morphology. When copyists unfamiliar with those subtleties recast phrases into a more neutral register, the embedded markers could be normalized away. Imagine a verb form that subtly signals deference to a maternal figure being converted into a neutral third person. What vanishes is not only a pronoun but a relational stance that anchored the original utterance. Such morphosyntactic smoothing often makes later interpreters miss the original social dynamics that gave the words their force. Another dimension lies in the habits of early readers who annotated texts for use rather than for preservation. Instead of marginal notes that merely comment, some readers developed proto-indexes, tiny signposts inserted at the edge of folios to guide communal reading cycles. Over generations these signposts were recopied as if they were intrinsic to the text itself, effectively collapsing user-created markers into authorial apparatus. When modern scholars encounter those signals without context, they can wrongly attribute organizational intent to the original composition. Pay attention to these navigational marks. They map practices of use more than provenance, and they can mislead attribution if treated as evidence of authorship. Abbreviation systems present a separate set of hazards. To conserve space and costly materials, scribes used standardized contractions and symbols that stood for entire phrases. Later editors, working from damaged or foreign exemplars, expanded those contractions according to the conventions of their own milieu. In some instances a contraction that once stood for a local epithet or household term was enlarged into a formal honorific familiar to the editor, thereby retrojecting a different social register onto the original line. That act of expansion is not neutral, it rewrites relationship and can convert a colloquial testimony into an institutional claim, erasing the intimacy that defined the original utterance. Finally, consider the ecosystem of pedagogical transmission that mediated many texts. Teachers often reduced complex conversations into schematic lists or mnemonic sketches for classroom use. Those compressed forms then entered apprentice notebooks and circulated as teaching templates. Over time the templates ossified into authoritative summaries detached from the dialogic contexts that birthed them. When historians rely on these distilled versions without recovering the fuller classroom exchanges, they inherit a flattened record that privileges concise doctrinal points over living argumentative practice. If you want to trace a marginalized voice authentically, follow the traces where pedagogy condensed conversation into form, the shorthand of classrooms, the compact lists in learners' margins, and the instructional summaries that quietly replace nuanced exchange. A surprising forensic frontier treats old books like ecological archives. Microscopic traces cling to pages, and these biological signatures reveal journeys that words alone cannot tell. Scientists now extract tiny protein fragments from the surface layer of a sheet and match them to herds and breeds. The result can point to unlikely trade corridors or seasonal movements of flocks that fed a book's manufacture. This biological fingerprinting sometimes overturns long-held assumptions about where a text was produced by showing materials sourced thousands of miles from the community that later claimed it. Equally revealing are isotopic ratios trapped in organic fibers. By measuring ratios of oxygen, strontium, and other elements embedded in binders and sizing agents, researchers reconstruct the environmental conditions in which materials originated. A glue that carries a coastal isotopic signature suggests maritime handling. A sewing thread with inland mineral ratios points to a river-valley workshop. These chemical maps create a layered geography of production and repair, and they permit dating strategies that refine chronologies when documentary dates are ambiguous. Dust and the microscopic life lodged in gatherings form another unexpected archive. Microbial communities, pollen grains, and tiny plant fragments survive in the grooves and gutters of old books, and each assemblage corresponds to a specific climate and season. Analysts can now distinguish a library long kept in a damp cellar from one stored in a sunlit loft by reading these biological residues. In parallel, the pattern and composition of insect remains, what species bored into which folios and where their waste accumulated, can indicate the sequence of a volume's travels across habitats and human dwellings. Turning to physical handling, chemical residues deposited by hands tell a story about readership. Lipid analysis can detect traces of perfumes, cooking oils, or particular plant saps. A persistent aromatic signature on the same set of pages across several volumes implies habitual use by a household that prepared certain foods or used certain cosmetics. When such chemical markers cluster around a single thread-stitched section, they point toward localized practice rather than general circulation, suggesting a small, attentive readership rather than broad institutional custody. Sewing patterns and repair materials provide material signatures of craftspeople who never signed a name. Examining knot styles, thread twists, and the botanical origins of cordage allows conservators to cluster books by workshop technique. Likewise, the composition of animal glues and the presence of resinous additives, analyzed down to their botanical fingerprints, reveal regional binder traditions. When multiple volumes share an identical set of stitching anomalies and glue chemistry, they likely passed through the same hands, reconstructing an invisible belt of custodianship that preserved certain texts. All of these strands, biological, isotopic, chemical, entomological, and technical, can be woven into relational maps that reconstruct circulation networks without relying on explicit labels. Visualizing these connections exposes pockets of readers and conservators who sustained particular voices despite being absent from official records. If you want to follow these material reconstructions as they appear and see maps that reposition neglected communities at the center of transmission, subscribe to the channel so new finds arrive in your feed. Now consider how these techniques apply to personal collections or family archives in your care. Simple tests of paper fiber, ink composition, and storage-related microflora can clarify provenance and challenge received stories about where documents were kept and who handled them most. You can partner with local conservators to sample a single corner of a page rather than risking the whole object, and the results often yield surprising reconnections between objects and the people who actually sustained them. Scholars now borrow tools from network science to map how texts moved and which relationships kept certain voices alive. Treat manuscripts, households, and marketplaces as interconnected points. Some act like lifelines, others like cul-de-sacs. A few intermediary agents, those who bridged language communities or hosted copying sessions, function as keystones. Remove them and the graph fractures, isolating clusters that never reach wider readership. Quantitative measures reveal surprising fragility. A handful of bridge nodes can account for the majority of long-distance transmissions, and their disappearance reshapes the topology of memory far more than random loss. This approach reframes erasure not as a single act but as a structural vulnerability that can be modeled, predicted, and, crucially, countered. Beyond abstract graphs, living networks had everyday brokers who rarely enter formal histories. Merchant families that kept multilingual ledgers, itinerant artisans who doubled as copyists, and intermarried clans linking port towns with inland villages all served as practical conduits. One recent archival trace, a fragmentary account book listing payments for translation between 3 dialects, suggests that a coastal household routinely financed the reproduction of local hymns for inland congregations. To hear about similar discoveries as they surface, consider subscribing. Small archives are being digitized now, and each upload can reconfigure circulation maps in unexpected ways. These brokers operated by trust and repetition rather than by institutional imprimatur, and recognizing their role expands the circle of responsibility for preservation. Workshop economies merit fresh attention because copyists were participants in market dynamics that shaped what got made. Workshop proprietors negotiated contracts, chose which texts to invest time in, and balanced demand against material cost. Some workshops specialized in rapid service copies for lay customers, producing concise devotional sheets that spread cheaply but left little archival residue. Other ateliers produced expensive illuminated codices intended for display. When we analyze payment records, material invoices, and the spatial distribution of surviving waste sheets, a pattern emerges. Economic incentives funneled resources toward a narrow set of formats, indirectly sidelining more conversational or domestic genres. This economic lens explains why some communicative forms vanish, not because of doctrinal rejection, but because they were uneconomical to reproduce at scale. Computational simulations now offer practical remediation strategies. By running counterfactual models that reinstate hypothetical bridge nodes, researchers can estimate how targeted digitization or local conservation would restore connectivity. These models also help prioritize which fragments to conserve first. A seemingly trivial household prayer might, if preserved and linked, reconnect multiple orphan strands across a region. Moreover, participatory projects that enlist descendant communities to help tag and interpret fragments increase interpretive bandwidth and democratize curatorial decisions. If you steward family papers, try forming a collaborative digitization plan with neighboring households. Small, coordinated efforts can produce network effects that single donations rarely achieve. Ethics and methodology converge when modeling voices. Algorithmic reconstruction can illuminate patterns but never replace contextual judgment. Over-reliance on simulated linkages risks smoothing contingency into inevitability. Therefore, every modeled hypothesis must be accompanied by transparent assumptions, uncertainty bounds, and community review. Engage with reconstructed networks as working proposals rather than final verdicts. Now, consider how this applies when you face a cluster of orphaned letters or a box of unlabeled papers. Treat them not only as isolated objects but as potential nodes in a living map, whose restoration depends as much on social collaboration and modest funding as on any single breakthrough in imaging or analysis. Architecture can act like a curator. The placement of thresholds, screens, and stairways determined not only who could stand near a speaker but which speeches mattered enough to be copied. Consider the subtle choreography of movement through sacred buildings, narrow vestibules that funneled lay people away from inner sanctums, raised chancels that separated officiants from congregants, and side chapels tucked behind thick walls. Each alteration to that choreography reshaped the audience for particular utterances. A teaching spoken in a dim side oratory had a much smaller potential readership than one delivered from a central pulpit, and that difference compounded over generations because fewer listeners meant fewer transcribers and fewer witnesses willing to vouch for its importance. Closely linked are practices of display and concealment embedded in construction choices. Some communities deliberately embedded texts within visible architectural features, inscribed slabs, painted bookholders, or shelf-like niches built into the nave, so words could be read during processions. Others placed precious volumes in locked armaria or behind lattices to protect them from damp and theft. When a renovation relocated a library from an exposed gallery into a vaulted storage room for preservation, it also shifted the social profile of readers. Access moved from an informal public to an appointed circle of caretakers. That logistical decision, neutral seeming to builders, had lasting interpretive effects by narrowing who could copy, quote, or argue from those texts. Processional geography mattered more than we often assume. Rituals that carried banners and folded books through streets were public performances that seeded communal memory. Texts displayed on those routes became part of collective conversation. A change in procession routes, whether due to urban redevelopment or overlay of new ceremonial priorities, could remove certain documents and phrases from the civic commons. When a town began routing major processions away from a particular quarter, perhaps after a plague or a change in patronage, words that once circulated through public encounter could recede into private memory and then into oblivion. If you care about how physical ordering reshapes whose voice survives, keep an eye on recent structural surveys. Laser-based scans and archival floor plans are revealing unexpected sightlines and hidden cupboards that alter long-standing assumptions. Enable notifications so you'll see reconstructed elevations and archival finds as they appear. These technical glimpses often expose where text sat in relation to eyes and footsteps, and that positional context changes how we assess a voice's reach. Renovation layers are a fertile place to read absence as information. Many churches were repurposed, partitioned, or raised and then lowered to meet new liturgical fashions. These modifications sometimes bury inscriptions beneath newer pavement or entomb books within thicker walls. Archaeologists who peel back a later floor can expose floor-level graffiti, slipped manuscripts, or carved initials that record an earlier, contrasted pattern of access. Those buried traces are not only physical, they encode episodes when a community intentionally redirected attention away from certain speakers and toward others. Methodologically, integrating architectural forensics with a detailed reading of placement language in inventories yields powerful insight. Three-dimensional reconstructions based on surviving beams, cornerstone alignments, and old photographs can simulate where a reader stood, where light fell at mid-morning, and which surfaces would have been legible without artificial illumination. Those reconstructions, paired with contemporaneous notes that mention the book kept by the east doorway or the homily read at the stair, permit targeted searches for lost material. For listeners who steward historic rooms or care for local chapels, simple measures, cataloging where books were kept, noting changes after building work, photographing niches before they are covered, can contribute crucial data to these reconstructions without disturbing the fabric. A lineage of tiny glyphs carved into dressed stone can speak across centuries in a language of craft rather than words. Stonemasons left idiosyncratic marks, chevrons, crosses, or shorthand initials, on blocks destined for the same monastery or manor. Charting identical marks across multiple buildings reveals a mobile workforce and the routes they traveled. When those routes intersect with documentary evidence, they expose who commissioned work and which households regularly hosted liturgical labor. These signatures function like trail markers. They pinpoint moments of production and, crucially, indicate which social actors paid for repeated structural attention that preserved specific liturgical settings. Beyond carved marks, builders sometimes interred portable objects inside structural cavities at key stages of construction. Archaeologists call these foundation deposits, and they often include small inscribed tokens, folded notes, or sewn scraps tucked beneath cornerstones. Unlike formal dedication plaques, these concealed caches were meant to be intimate and enduring. Their contents frequently preserve personal invocations, names rarely recorded elsewhere, and requests for protection tied to particular family lines. Recovering such deposits transforms anonymous masonry into an archive of lived commitments and provides direct evidence of the actors who invested daily attention in a sacred place. Temporary architectural forms played a comparable but overlooked role in circulating teachings. Pilgrimage encampments, market booths, and shipboard cabins were traveling theaters where instruction spread through repeated encounter. Portable shrines and sewn prayer rolls accompanied groups across landscapes, carrying variations of local prayers that adapted to new audiences. Tracing stitch patterns and fabric provenance across recovered textile fragments reveals networks of movement that formal libraries never served, and shows how itinerant communities curated their own repertories without relying on fixed architecture. Metalwork on doors, benches, and chests offers another archival channel. Hinges bear makers' stamps, lock plates sometimes include donor initials, bench ends preserve carved names or pictorial emblems that demarcate seating and social order. When these fittings survive rehousing or reuse, they preserve a register of who routinely occupied specific positions within communal life. Mapping those fixtures across a town, linking a carved bench end in a parish to a similarly ornamented pew in a neighboring chapel, reconstructs patterns of habitual presence and the everyday loci of influence that formal textual catalogs typically ignore. Contractual plans and builders' briefs constructed a legal scaffolding for speech by specifying who could convene in certain rooms and at which hours. Notary drafts sometimes attached minute floor sketches to deeds, laying out rights to use a room for nightly prayers, markets, or dispute hearings. These technical addenda, often overlooked in textual editions, record negotiated access to space, agreements that assign time slots or reserved liturgical privileges to families or guilds. Consulting these plans alongside surviving fabric reveals the ways spatial rights were legally secured, traded, or contested, practical arrangements that shaped who could address the community from particular platforms. If you care about tracing these invisible authorship networks, there are ways to begin on the ground: photograph carved marks, record metal stamps, and ask local conservators to search for sealed cavities during routine maintenance. Midway through this exploration, consider subscribing to receive new image sets and transcriptions as they are released. Each uploaded dossier can reorient a building's biography. Now, consider how this applies when you face a row of anonymous stones in a small chapel, with attention to makers' marks, hidden deposits, and hardware inscriptions. That anonymous wall can become a ledger of human collaboration, revealing the practical infrastructure that once gave voice to particular people and practices. Conservation is not a neutral caretaking chore, it is a series of judgment calls that alter what future readers can perceive. Decisions about whether to humidify and flatten a warped sheet, to reinforce torn edges with modern fibers, or to surface clean centuries of grime each carry consequences. Some treatments clarify text and make items legible for immediate study, while others erase evidence of use, the stains of fingers, the smudged annotations, the accidental tears that testify to how an object lived. Those material biographies are often the very traces historians prize when reconstructing marginal voices, so interventions that prioritize visual neatness over contextual integrity risk silencing information as surely as any deliberate censorship. Equally significant is the choice of documentation. Every treatment should begin with exhaustive recording, high-resolution before and after imaging, chemical sampling logs, and a chain of custody narrative explaining the rationale. Yet institutional pressures sometimes compress that process. Donors want public display, grant cycles demand quick outcomes, curators seek visual appeal for exhibitions. In those moments expediency can trump thoroughness, leaving future researchers with an object that is physically stabilized but historically impoverished. When you handle family papers or local archives, insist on full records of any work performed. Such metadata is the forensic breadcrumb trail that lets others retrace or challenge restoration pathways years hence. The materials conservators select matter, too. Adhesives that bond well decades ago may now become brittle or discolor, deforming margins and masking ink. Laminating fragile leaves into synthetic sandwiches makes handling safe but creates a permanent composite that obscures texture and inhibits later analytical techniques. Contemporary practice emphasizes reversibility, yet not every so-called reversible intervention remains so across centuries of chemical change. A well-intentioned repair can calcify into an obstacle for spectral analysis or strand-level fiber tests that would otherwise reveal provenance clues. That technical tension places moral weight on choosing temporary fixes that genuinely can be undone, and on cataloging precisely which compounds were used. Public presentation introduces another vector of editorial effect. Exhibitions select a handful of pieces to symbolize broader stories, and framing text often compresses complexity into digestible slogans. A display that foregrounds an artifact's ornamental beauty while downplaying marginal notes or odd bindings steers audiences away from the messy practices that sustain minority voices. If institutions want to recover suppressed narratives, they must resist the temptation to aestheticize at the cost of nuance. Engage as a viewer, read multi-layered labels, demand access to digitized context files, and question displays that omit provenance debates. Access policy is a quieter but powerful determinant of survival. Closed stacks, restrictive reproduction rights, and paywalled digital surrogates concentrate interpretive power. Conversely, open-access platforms that publish raw scans and full metadata decentralize inquiry and invite community expertise. However, wide dissemination brings its own dilemmas. Exposure can prompt unauthorized fragmentation, illicit trade, or misattribution. Balancing protective custody with scholarly openness requires policies shaped by ethical foresight rather than institutional convenience. Now, consider how this applies when you steward heirlooms. A private scan in a shared repository invites collaboration, while keeping artifacts hidden limits the likelihood that forgotten lines of transmission will ever be recovered. Community participation reframes conservation as collaborative stewardship rather than top-down caretaking. When descendant groups, local custodians, and specialist conservators negotiate treatment priorities together, choices reflect a plurality of values, ritual significance, scholarly interest, and emotional attachment. That participatory model also recalibrates risk assessment. Some communities prefer ritual access over aesthetic preservation, accepting where is meaningful. Recognizing such preferences prevents technical professionalism from inadvertently erasing living practices and acknowledges that preservation aims differ across stakeholders. If these practical stakes fascinate you, follow this thread. Conservation choices are interpretive acts. By paying attention to what is repaired, what is left raw, and who gets a voice in these choices, you begin to map how material decisions become historical arguments. Subscribe to receive detailed case studies and treatment dossiers that reveal, in candid technical detail, how preservation can either restore a marginalized speaker or quiet them forever. A legal and commercial framework often dictates which artifacts remain visible and which vanish into private ledgers. Title disputes, export permits, and national patrimony statutes create corridors and choke points for movement, turning objects into legal proxies for identity and power. Picture a ledger book that cannot cross a border without a notarized lineage. That administrative friction channels what survives into certain repositories and away from others. These regulatory gatekeepers shape not by taste but by law, and their rulings ripple outward. A contested certificate can halt an international loan, freeze funding for local repair, or trigger a sale that disperses related fragments across distant collections. Market dynamics amplify those effects in unpredictable ways. High-end auction rooms and specialized dealers operate on signals, rare provenance, courtroom clearance, celebrity ownership, that transform mundane fragments into headline lots. When a small parish faces sudden maintenance costs, trustees sometimes monetize manuscripts, inadvertently scattering a coherent corpus. This commercial extraction separates linked items, dispersing marginalia and annotations that made the set intelligible. Meanwhile, Gray markets and opaque chains of custody permit objects with unclear histories to circulate in zones of legal ambiguity, where recovery becomes costly and provenance reconstruction becomes a forensic task rather than a scholarly one. Authentication and dispute resolution provide a different lever over survival, bringing a courtroom logic into archives. Independent panels, export control hearings, and intergovernmental agreements determine not only legitimacy but accessibility. An object under legal challenge may be sequestered for years, unavailable for study while its fate is litigated. Midway through such a contest, public interest often grows, scholarship intensifies, journalists spotlight gaps, and that heightened scrutiny can reverse earlier neglect. If you want curated alerts on unfolding restitution claims and evidentiary breakthroughs, join our updates to follow the legal turns that reshape who gets to keep and speak for the past. Financial instruments further rewrite conservation priorities. Cultural insurers, indemnity schemes, and loan guarantees allocate risk, influencing which institutions accept fragile loans or invest in long-term care. Insurers price not only physical vulnerability but also legal exposure. Items prone to title claims can carry prohibitive premiums, nudging owners toward sale rather than long-term maintenance. Endowments and trust funds exist to underwrite upkeep, yet their conditionalities, restricted use, reporting requirements, can reframe how objects are used, sometimes privileging exhibition value over contextual integrity. For custodians balancing limited budgets, fiscal architecture often dictates fate more decisively than scholarly interest. Environmental change now imposes an operational calculus once unimaginable. Saltwater intrusion, accelerated freeze-thaw cycles, and urban heat islands alter microclimates, making single-site repositories risky propositions. Institutions increasingly adopt a dispersed custody model, redundant holdings stored across different climatic zones, rotating displays to limit exposure, and establishing rapid transfer agreements with distant partners. These logistics transform the idea of a collection from a fixed assembly to a distributed network requiring legal paperwork, transport protocols, and mutual care pacts. That shift can democratize access if executed transparently, or it can atomize heritage when economic pressures drive fragments into private hands. Practical steps matter for anyone guarding family papers or small archives. Document legal provenance now, photograph items under consistent lighting, register relevant basics with municipal heritage offices so export or sale requires formal notice. Engage a lawyer versed in cultural property law before loaning items abroad, and explore pooled insurance options with neighboring institutions to spread cost. These measures do not guarantee survival, but they make disappearance a matter of contested process rather than quiet attrition. If you value being part of that process, sign up to receive concise, actionable guides on legal safeguards and financial strategies that help keep fragile histories intact. Hidden coding strategies represent a distinct layer of survival that escapes conventional cataloging, phrases tucked into the first letters of consecutive lines, simple substitution ciphers painted into margins, or intentional misspellings that only a recognized network would read correctly. These practices are not marginal curiosities, they were deliberate tactics for preserving contentious ideas while avoiding scrutiny. Think of them as private notations sewn into the seams of texts, intentionally opaque to casual readers but perfectly legible to those trained in the system. Their existence changes the analytical stakes because a single undeciphered pattern can contain decades of conversation. Different groups favored different mechanisms. Some used acrostics that run vertically down a page, turning what appears to be a commonplace prayer into a signed testament when you read the initial letters. Others employed numeric substitutions derived from household counting systems, where familiar tallies correspond to consonants and vowels in a locally understood cipher. Bookbinders could also collaborate. Blanks within end leaves were scored with seemingly decorative motifs that, read by a skilled eye, reveal sequences of instructions or names. Each method trades ease of access for safety, and the variety suggests deliberate innovation rather than sporadic secrecy. Craft traditions supplied ready-made encipherment vocabularies. Knitting patterns, bead count sequences, and ceramic scoring systems can encode alphabetic values in ways that look perfectly ordinary to an outsider. A row of pearl stitches might denote a consonant, a cluster of beads on a cord could mark an entire theological formula. These signals traveled with everyday objects, shawls, prayer cords, cooking implements, so that movement across households also circulated in coded content. The advantage is practical. Craft encoding allows a message to travel under the cover of routine exchange without requiring a written exemplar that could be confiscated. Detecting such systems requires methods outside standard philology. Pattern recognition algorithms can flag unusual repetitions, but human intuition remains essential for plausible decoding hypotheses. Ethnographers who understand local craft semantics help translate stitch patterns into probable letter mappings. Computational linguists apply frequency analyses that test whether an apparent pattern fits a true textual distribution. Historians provide contextual anchors that constrain likely meanings. If you want to watch a real-time example of a decoded sequence that altered attribution in a major case, subscribe. New walkthroughs and decoded transcriptions are released periodically and often prompt lively scholarly debate. There are practical protocols that scholars now follow when approaching potential cipher traces. First, assemble a corpus of suspected exemplars so statistical comparisons can expose consistent correspondences. Next, triangulate with oral histories and family memory to identify plausible lexemes that would be meaningful for the community that produced the code. Then, test candidate mappings against independent passages. A valid decryption will produce coherent syntax and semantic fields in multiple instances, not only in one artifact. This iterative procedure reduces false positives where random motifs are misread as deliberate encoding. Ethical complexities arise because many of these encodings were designed to protect communities, and public exposure can endanger descendant groups or trivialize intimate practices. That calls for collaborative stewardship, involve living communities in decisions about decoding, publication, and access. At the same time, responsibly revealing decoded passages can rectify historical silences by restoring attributed utterances to suppressed speakers. The technical side and the moral side are inseparable. Decoding without community consent risks repeating the very erasures the codes were meant to prevent. Finally, consider the practical payoff. When an encoded thread is unraveled, it often reframes relationships, litigation, and lineage claims that archival silence obscured. A ciphered list of correspondence can map a network long presumed absent, a stitched formula can reassign authorship, a hidden prayer can restore ritual practice to its rightful originators. Paying attention to these shadowed systems expands the range of recoverable voices and invites new forms of collaborative history-making. Reflecting on this journey so far, you can feel the weight of absence as something tangible, not merely a gap but a living pressure that shapes what surfaces and what remains submerged. The forces at work have been less like a single erasure and more like a sustained choreography of attention, decisions made in quiet rooms, incremental practices that tilt notice toward some voices and away from others. That cumulative tilt reshapes the contours of memory in ways that are rarely obvious until the moment someone begins to read for absence rather than presence. When you start listening for what was kept out of earshot, the whole scene reframes itself. Silence no longer seems merely passive but actively constitutive. There is a logic to this reorientation. Patterns that once appeared isolated become nodes in a larger field of shaping influences. Gestures of care and gestures of neglect register as complementary moves in a story of preservation and loss. The artifacts of a past community are not inert relics but surfaces that have accrued decisions, choices about display, custody, and circulation, that carry interpretive force. Looking at them sympathetically, you begin to sense an argument embedded not only in words but in material ordering and cultural habit. That argument has been persuasive precisely because it was enacted at scale and repeated until it felt natural, until the absence of certain voices felt like an unremarkable baseline. That same realization also reframes responsibility. Recovering a voice is not only a matter of technical retrieval, it is an ethical conversation about who gets to decide how fragments are restored, narrated, and shared. The stakes are layered: scholarly credibility, communal identity, and the lived attachments of people who see themselves reflected in recovered traces. Approaching these stakes demands a posture of humility and partnership, an openness to being surprised or corrected. When stewardship is conceived as a collective practice rather than a one-way rescue, the process itself becomes a corrective to earlier patterns that rendered some speakers peripheral. At the level of method, Thinking in terms of relationships rather than isolated objects produces different questions. Instead of asking whether a particular piece survives, you start to ask how clusters of evidence might reconfigure one another, how modest recoveries alter the plausibility of broader narratives, and how provisional reconstructions change what communities feel authorized to remember. This relational stance invites provisionality. Reconstructions are offered as conditional, subject to refinement as new connections appear. That epistemic modesty is not weakness, it is the discipline that prevents confident silence from hardening into unquestioned canon. And there is an effective dimension that matters for how this conversation enters public life. Recoveries do not merely add pages to a ledger, they reorient attention, unsettle inherited certainties, and invite new forms of identification. When an obscured speech re-emerges, it carries with it the capacity to reframe authority and to recalibrate whose questions are treated as constitutive. That ripple reaches beyond the academy, into communities of faith, into households, and into civic imaginaries where histories are invoked to justify claims about belonging and right. As we pivot toward the final reflection, hold these convergences in mind: absence shaped by practice, responsibility reimagined as collaboration, and methods that foreground relationality and humility. Let this cumulative sense, part ethical, part methodological, part communal, settle as the groundwork for what comes next. The closing passage will invite you to carry forward that tension between recovery and restraint, to consider how renewed listening changes what we ask of the past and of one another. Light moves differently across a rediscovered page. It does not simply reveal ink, it reveals relation. The act of finding a line attributed to a person once pushed to the margins pulls into relief the way power organizes memory. What seemed like a simple archival omission emerges instead as a deliberate architecture of silence, layers of material choice, legal constraint, aesthetic preference, and everyday practice that together composed a world in which certain voices became treasured and others were made peripheral. That architecture is not inert. It shaped institutions, habits, and identities. It calibrated what communities remembered and what they forgot. To read for absence is therefore to read for power. The negative spaces in our records are active elements of history, and attending to them changes the shape of what we inherit. Recovering those buried registers requires attention that is simultaneously technical and tender. Spectral imaging, microbial forensics, network analysis, acoustic reconstruction, and the patient labor of conservators are not neutral instruments, they are ways of listening with tools. Each technique reframes evidence as relationship rather than as relic. The microscopic protein on a folio corner, the rhythm of a surviving chant, the placement of a book on a shelf, all of these are partial vocabularies for a voice that did not only speak in texts. But equipment and expertise must be yoked to ethics. The right to interpret, to publish, or to exhibit cannot be divorced from the communities whose lives are implicated. True recovery demands partnership, scholars and descendants, conservators and caretakers, readers and stewards, working with humility, transparency, and an honest account of uncertainty. That collaboration converts archival rescue into collective remembering, and remembering into responsibility. This is not merely a matter for specialists, it refracts into ordinary decisions about whose stories count today. The methods we use to reconstruct the past also teach us how to handle living silences, what we conserve, what we put on display, and whom we authorize to speak. The impulse to tidy, to aestheticize, or to monetize objects has consequences that outlast any single exhibition. Conversely, small acts, cataloging a family notebook, documenting a binding before restoration, asking elders for context, become cumulative. If you wish to follow this work, to see fragments rejoin their networks, to witness a marginalized voice re-enter public conversation, stay engaged with the communities and platforms that host these discoveries. Subscribe, participate, lend an hour or a photograph. Attention is itself a form of preservation. The true practice begins now, not as a triumph of recovery but as a sustained habit of listening that recognizes absence as evidence and relationships as history. Carry the recovered line into daylight not to enshrine it as final truth but to use it as a hinge, one that lets us open new doors in the present. Let that hinge loosen ossified certainties about authority and belonging, and let it invite more voices into the rooms where we speak about faith, identity, and power. The lesson is simple and profound: history is not only a ledger of names but an ongoing conversation about who counts. If we are willing to keep listening, carefully, collaboratively, and with patient humility, then the stories we inherit will be truer to the lives that made them, and the communities they touch will find themselves more fully, more fairly represented in the work of memory.